I always believed that sacrifice was the price of admission for this family. My name is Chloe Lee, and for 10 years I scraped by on minimum wage, convinced my suffering was noble. I watched my brother live in luxury while I drowned, told over and over that there just wasn't enough money to go around. That lie held until my grandfather shattered the silence at my birthday dinner. He revealed a secret worth $2 million, proving my poverty wasn't bad luck, but a theft committed by the people supposed to protect me. Now I have to decide, do I stay silent or do I burn it all down? Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The air in the private dining room hung thick with the scent of truffle oil and the suffocating pressure of expectation. It was my 27th birthday, and I was trapped. Outside Main Street flickered with the cold, damp glow of streetlights mirroring the cold dread pooling in my stomach. This wasn't a family celebration. It was a performance staged at a place fancier than we really needed to be, designed to project success, polish, and togetherness, everything I felt we lacked. I looked down the long, glossy table. The cast of characters was familiar. There were my parents, Helen and Thomas Lee, beaming with the practiced, benevolent smiles of small business owners who also happened to be pillars of their church and the local community. To the untrained eye, they were the perfect success story. Next to them was my brother Nathan Lee, the golden child. At 24, he was deep in med school, radiating that confident, effortless grace reserved for those who know they are undeniably the future of the family. Then there was me, Chloe Lee, the background daughter. I'd spent my entire adult life as the utility player, filling gaps at the family restaurant, covering unexpected bills when mom and dad invested in their latest renovation, and generally keeping the peace. I juggled a full-time job in hospital administration with gig work on the side just to keep my student loans from dropping into default, all because I dropped out of state university after 1 year. I couldn't afford tuition, and the family couldn't spare the cash. Yet there I sat, watching them bask in the reflected light of Nathan's achievement. My parents always framed my struggle as a virtue. "You're tough, Chloe," my mother would say, tapping my arm with an almost aggressive affection. "You're so independent. Nathan needs more support right now. That's where our focus has to be." It was their recurring monologue, a justification for the enforced neglect that had defined my early 20s. I was independent because they forced me to be. I was tough because the alternative was breaking. The only genuinely warm presence at the table was Jordan Brooks, my best friend and hospital co-worker, who had insisted on dragging me out tonight, refusing to let me spend another birthday alone in my tiny apartment. Even he couldn't fully cut through the tension. I was already on edge, feeling emotionally ambushed by the performative toasts and the fake warmth that felt less like love and more like a tight, suffocating leash. The subtle acts of favoritism were not even subtle anymore, just standard operating procedure. During the main course, my mother Helen stood up holding a small velvet box. "A little something for Nathan," she chirped, sliding the box toward him. "For surviving those grueling finals, you deserve it, sweetie." He opened it to reveal an expensive engraved watch, a symbol of the family's faith in his path. When it was my turn, my mother handed me a slender, tissue-wrapped gift. It was a generic vanilla-scented candle set from a mass-market store. Chloe was always the strong one who never needed anything. "My father," Thomas chuckled, raising his wine glass. "Nathan, he's the investment. We need to make sure that pays off." The jokes landed like small, sharp stones. I swallowed the bitterness, focusing on the tiramisu that had just arrived. I was done reacting, done being grateful for the crumbs. I just needed the night to end. Then came the silence that changed everything. During dessert, my grandfather, Samuel Hahn, slowly raised his water glass. He was usually quiet, observant, the retired factory worker who had immigrated decades ago and mostly watched the family theater unfold in silence. "Chloe," he said, his voice slow and steady, cutting through the polite hum of conversation. "I still think about that lawyer after the accident. I hope the money from the settlement helped you build the life you deserved after you were sacrificed like that." The table froze. My fork, loaded with tiramisu, stopped midway to my mouth. Settlement money sacrificed. The words ricocheted around the small, silent room. Helen was the first to react, forcing a loud, brittle laugh. "Appa, you're confusing things again," she said. Her smile stretched too tight. There was no settlement for Chloe. "You know that. It was all settled by the company years ago. Small claim. Nothing." Grandpa Samuel's face, usually gentle, darkened into a mask of sudden cold fury. "Don't lie," he said, the two words hitting the table like a gavel. "You told me the insurance company paid over $2 million. For her." My whole world stopped revolving. The flickering candlelight blurred. That's the second my life split in two before I heard the number, and after my own parents tried to erase me with it. Grandpa's words hung in the air like smoke, stinging my eyes and choking the breath out of me. $2 million. The sheer impossibility of the number acted like a trigger, violently yanking me out of the restaurant and hurling me back 10 years into the passenger seat of a beat-up sedan on a rainy Tuesday night. I was 17. My older sister Emily was driving us home from a late shift at the restaurant. Emily was everything I wasn't: charismatic, driven, the undisputed star of the Lee family universe. I was just her shadow, happy to ride in her wake. I remembered the rhythmic thwack hiss of the windshield wipers, the way the streetlights blurred against the glass, and the sudden blinding glare of headlights running a red light. I remembered the scream of tires, the crunch of metal, and then a silence so profound it felt like the end of the world. That drunk driver didn't just total a car, he dismantled my family's hierarchy. Emily died on impact. I survived with a broken collarbone, 3 fractured ribs, and a concussion, but the real injury was invisible. In the weeks that followed, a narrative solidified around the tragedy, harder and colder than concrete. Emily was the perfect daughter, the angel taken too soon. I was the survivor, the walking reminder of what they had lost. I felt like an error in the universe's accounting, an accident that had stolen Emily's future and left me with a debt I could never repay. My parents didn't comfort me. They conscripted me into their grief. "We lost your sister." My mother would sob, gripping my shoulders with bruising force. "You must be strong now, Chloe. Don't burden us. We have already sacrificed so much. We can't handle any more trouble." I internalized that message deep in my marrow. I learned to shrink, to make my needs invisible, because my grief was required to be small compared to theirs. If I cried, I was being dramatic. If I needed help, I was being selfish. I became a ghost in my own house, haunting the hallways, while my parents built a shrine to the daughter they actually wanted. But there were cracks in the story, memories that had always sat wrong in my stomach, now suddenly illuminated by Grandpa's revelation. I remembered strange meetings in the months following the funeral. A man in a gray suit, a lawyer, coming to the house. I remembered sitting at the top of the stairs listening to the murmur of voices below. Once, when I tried to enter the living room, my mother had physically blocked the doorway, her face tight with stress. "Go upstairs, Chloe," she had snapped. "This is adult stuff. You don't need to worry about it." I remembered a quiet Sunday afternoon, not long after the lawyer's visit stopped, when Grandpa Samuel had asked, "Are you saving that money for Chloe's future? For her schooling?" My mother had replied sharply, almost too quickly, "Of course, Appa. Everything is for the girls, for the family." I had assumed they were talking about a life insurance payout for Emily, something modest to cover the funeral. I never imagined the settlement was for me. The disparity between my life and Nathan's suddenly snapped into a gruesome focus. I had scraped my way into a decent state university, fueled by sleepless nights and desperation. But after 1 year, the tuition hike came. I called home begging for a small loan to cover the gap. My mother's voice on the phone had been cold, dripping with disappointment. "We can't threaten your brother's future for your hobbies, Chloe," she had said. "Nathan is going to be a doctor. He will help the whole family. You need to figure this out. Be independent." So I dropped out. I came home. I worked 2 jobs. I watched Nathan sail into an expensive private college and then straight into med school, driving a new car, living in a fully furnished apartment, never once working a shift at the restaurant. I had accepted it all because I believed the lie that we were poor, that the restaurant was struggling, that my sacrifice was noble. I thought I was being the hero by not asking for anything. But looking at my parents now across this table laden with food I couldn't afford, I realized the sickening truth. It wasn't nobility. It was enforced neglect. They had been systematically erasing me, using my own tragedy to fund the life they wanted for their son, pretending they only ever had one child to care for. The flashback receded, leaving me trembling in the cold restaurant air. The silence at the table was still absolute. My mother's face was pale, her eyes darting nervously toward Nathan. Grandpa Samuel didn't blink. He repeated the words, anchoring me to the horror of the present. "I saw the papers, Helen. $2.4 million for Chloe." A coldness spread through my chest, replacing the shock. I whispered to myself, the realization tasting like ash on my tongue. If there was money, then every time they told me to figure it out alone was a lie. I didn't walk out of the restaurant. I erupted from it. The heavy glass door slammed behind me, vibrating in its frame, but the noise wasn't loud enough to drown out the roaring in my ears. The cool night air hit my flushed skin, but it did nothing to cool the rage boiling in my blood. Jordan was right on my heels, his presence a steady anchor in the storm. He didn't try to shush me. He just stood guard as I paced the asphalt, my hands shaking so hard I couldn't make a fist. "They sacrificed my life." I choked out the words, tearing at my throat. "They pretended it was my choice to be the martyr. They tried to erase me, Jordan. They looked me in the eye for 10 years and lied." Before Jordan could answer, the restaurant door opened again. Nathan jogged out, looking genuinely bewildered, his expensive watch catching the street lamp's glare. "Chloe, stop," he pleaded, reaching for my arm. "Mom's upset. She's crying inside. Just come back in and we can talk about this rationally." I ripped my arm away as if he were contagious. "Rationally, go back to your party, Nathan. This doesn't concern the golden boy." He opened his mouth to argue, but a shadow detached itself from the building's awning. Grandpa Samuel stepped into the ring of light, his expression grim and resolved. He bypassed Nathan entirely and stood in front of me. "I will take you to her," he said quietly. "The lawyer who handled the wrongful death case. I remember her name." I stared at him, my chest heaving. "You knew all this time?" "I suspected," he corrected gently. "I saw the new house, the cars. I wanted to believe they were using their own success. I assumed the settlement money was in a trust locked away for your future, for your healing. I told myself they wouldn't steal from their own wounded child." He looked toward the restaurant window where my parents were likely scrambling to spin the narrative. I was wrong to look away. 2 days later, I sat in the plush leather chair of attorney Maria Alvarez's office. The room smelled of old paper and lemon polish. Maria, a sharp woman in her 50s who remembered the case vividly, pulled a thick file box from the archives. She laid the documents out on the mahogany desk, turning them to face me. The text was black and white, undeniable. Chloe J. Lee. The words "sole beneficiary" were typed next to a sum that made the room spin. "Your parents were listed as guardians and trustees," Maria explained, her voice calm but edged with professional concern. "They had a legal fiduciary duty to protect this money for you until you turned 21. It was not for the household. It was not for your brother. It was exclusively for your care, your rehabilitation, and your future." I stared at the signatures, my mother's looping script, my father's jagged scrawl authorizing the setup of the account. Then I looked at the date, 10 years ago. A montage of misery flashed through my mind, superimposed over the legal jargon. I saw myself sleeping on a friend's lumpy couch during my sophomore year because I couldn't afford a dorm room. I felt the bone-deep ache of working a double shift at the hospital while fighting the flu, shivering so hard I dropped a stack of files, terrified I'd lose the job I needed to pay for groceries. I remembered walking into a bank to ask for a tuition loan and being denied because I had no credit history and no cosigner. "They didn't just neglect me," I whispered, tracing my own name on the paper. "They spent my lifeline and watched me drown." My phone felt heavy as a brick in my hand. I dialed my mother. I needed to hear it. I needed to hear her justify this. She answered on the second ring, her voice tight. "Chloe, are you done with this tantrum? Your father is a wreck." "I'm at Maria Alvarez's office," I said, my voice trembling not with fear, but with a terrifying clarity. "I see the papers, Mom. Sole beneficiary, 2.4 million. There was a pause, and then the shift happened. The weeping mother vanished, replaced by the cold pragmatist who had managed my life into the ground. "We did what was best for the family," she snapped. "You don't know how hard things were after the accident. The business was failing. We were going to lose everything." "It was my money," I said. "Blood money for my injury. For Emily." "It wasn't your money," she yelled, the mask slipping completely. "It was the family's money. We all sacrificed. We fed you, we clothed you, we kept a roof over your head. Don't you dare threaten us with lawyers, Chloe. We are your parents. You owe us your life." "I don't owe you a damn thing," I said, and I hung up. The silence in the office was heavy. Maria looked at me, her eyes hard. "If what you're describing is true, that the money is gone and was used for their personal gain, they could be liable for fraud, theft, and breach of trust. We will need a forensic accountant to trace every cent." I looked out the window at the town that had always praised the Lee family for their resilience, their success, their perfect American dream. It was all a lie built on the bones of my future. That's when I decided, I told Maria, meeting her gaze. If they wanted to pretend I didn't exist, I'd make sure the whole town saw exactly what they tried to erase. The forensic accountant Maria hired didn't just find numbers. He excavated the skeleton of my family's false success. The report arrived a week later, a thick, spiral-bound indictment of my parents' morality. Sitting at my kitchen table, I turned the pages, and with every transaction, a new piece of my reality fractured. It was a montage of theft, itemized and dated. I saw the withdrawal that covered the down payment on the Lees' sprawling suburban home, a house with a guest room I was told was too small for me when I needed a place to stay after college. I traced the funds that paid for the massive remodel of the restaurant, transforming it from a humble diner into the trendy, exposed brick hotspot it was today. I had scraped grease off those floors and bussed those tables for free, told by my father that we were investing in our future, when in reality, my money had paid for the very chairs I wasn't allowed to sit in. Then came the specific insults. Tuition payments to Nathan's private university, checks for his luxury apartment complex, and perhaps the most stinging of all, a silent partnership in a boutique yoga studio under my mother's name. She had used my pain, my settlement for a broken body, and a dead sister to fund her hobby while I was denied a loan for textbooks. It was nauseating. The community saw the Lees as the ultimate immigrant success story. We were the generous family that donated to the church building fund, sponsored the local Little League team, and gave free meals to the town's police and firefighters. But looking at these bank statements, I realized that their generosity was a fraud. My stolen money had purchased their reputation. They had built a monument to their own benevolence on a foundation of larceny, funding the image of the perfect family who made it by cannibalizing the one child they deemed expendable. Something inside me, the part that had been trained to stay quiet and not rock the boat, finally died. In its place, a cold, hard resolve began to calcify. Old Chloe would have worried about causing a scene. New Chloe looked at the numbers and thought, they want to threaten me with being ungrateful. Fine. I'll show them what gratitude looks like when the truth comes out. I started journaling that night, documenting not just the money, but the emotional blackmail that had accompanied every dollar spent. I connected the dots between their financial abuse and the psychological warfare they had waged to keep me compliant. Jordan sat with me, reading over my shoulder, his expression darkening with every page. As a Black man in America, he understood systemic injustice in a way I was only beginning to grasp within my own micro-universe. He saw the power dynamics clearly. "You've been taught to protect them at your own expense, Chloe," he said, pointing to a line item where they had bought a new SUV the same week I was walking to work in the rain. That's not loyalty. That's control. They groomed you to be the victim so they could be the heroes. I feel like I'm betraying them, I admitted, the old guilt flaring up. They're my parents. You're allowed to fight for yourself, Jordan countered, his voice firm. That's not selfish, that's freedom. You have a right to your own life. If you don't draw the line, they will eat the rest of your future too. The tremors of my investigation must have reached them, because the next day the flying monkeys arrived. My Aunt Grace, Helen's older sister, called me while I was on my lunch break. She didn't ask how I was. She went straight for the jugular. Your mom is sick over this, Chloe, she hissed. She can't sleep. You're going to ruin everything. They stole $2 million from me, Aunt Grace, I said, keeping my voice steady. It's family money, she argued, echoing the same toxic refrain. Think of your father's reputation, the restaurant, our standing in the church. If this goes public, people will judge all of us. Do you want to shame us? Don't erase your own family like this. I'm not the one who did the erasing, I replied. They erased me first. They just didn't think I'd ever check the ledger. Grace switched from guilt to fear. You will lose everyone. No one likes a daughter who sues her parents. I hung up, realizing she was right about one thing. They were terrified. But they weren't afraid of losing me. They had already discarded me years ago. They were afraid of losing face. They were more terrified of the neighbors knowing the truth than they were of destroying their daughter. That afternoon, I returned to Maria's office. She looked up from the forensic report, her face grim but satisfied. We have them, Chloe, she said. This is clear-cut misappropriation of funds. We have enough evidence for a formal demand letter, and if necessary, a massive lawsuit. We can prove fraud. I looked at the stack of papers, the tangible proof of my parents' betrayal. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle onto my shoulders. The next step meant war, I said, looking Maria in the eye. It meant putting my parents' betrayal into writing and sliding it across a table they could no longer control. The demand letter didn't go out with a bang, but with the quiet, terrifying efficiency of a courier service. Maria Alvarez drafted it with surgical precision, a full accounting of the misused funds, a demand for immediate restitution and the transfer of assets, and a stark warning of the civil and potential criminal consequences if they failed to comply. It was a legal grenade pinned and tossed into the living room of my childhood home. The explosion was immediate and digital. My phone began to vibrate before the courier could have possibly made it back to his van. My father, Thomas, was the first to strike. His text message was brief and designed to target my deepest insecurities. You're tearing this family apart over money. Is this how you honor your sister's memory? By destroying everything we built in her name? I stared at the screen, nausea roiling in my gut. He was using Emily again. He was using the sister whose death had paid for his comfort to shame me into silence. Then came the voicemails from my mother. I listened to them in the safety of my car, Jordan sitting silently beside me. The first was a sobbing, incoherent plea about how much they loved me, how they had sacrificed everything. The second, left 10 minutes later, was pure rage. You are ungrateful, her voice hissed through the speaker, distorted by anger. After everything we did for you, if you love us, you'll drop this. Don't you dare threaten us with court. You think you can survive without this family? You are nothing without us. Jordan reached over and turned the phone off. They're scared, he said simply. But the most complicated betrayal was yet to come. Nathan asked to meet. We met on a park bench halfway between the hospital and his medical school campus. He looked tired, his golden boy veneer cracking at the edges. He didn't look me in the eye when he spoke. He admitted that he had always assumed there was some kind of fund helping the family, but he never asked questions because everything was just taken care of. I didn't know it was yours, Chloe, he said, wringing his hands. I just thought, I don't know, I thought Mom and Dad had savings. I thought the restaurant was doing better than it was. You chose not to know, I said, my voice trembling. You never wondered why your sister was delivering groceries at midnight in a rusted-out Honda while you drove a car the settlement paid for. You never wondered why I was crying over rent money while you were living in a luxury apartment. He flinched. I just wanted to focus on school. They told me to focus on school. And I wanted to go to school too, Nathan, I snapped. But I paid for yours. I walked away from him feeling heavier than before. I was standing at a moral crossroads that felt impossible to navigate. Maria had explained that based on the evidence we could easily push for criminal charges. Fraud, embezzlement, grand larceny. I could send my parents to prison. Part of me, the part that had been screaming in the dark for 10 years, wanted to see them in handcuffs. I wanted them to feel the helplessness I had lived with. But another part of me, the daughter raised on stories of sacrifice and family loyalty, recoiled at the thought. Was that justice? Or was it just cruelty? Grandpa Samuel was the one who steadied me. We sat on his small porch that evening watching the sun go down. I don't know if I can do it, Grandpa, I confessed. I don't want to destroy them. I just want my life back. Justice isn't the same as revenge, Chloe. He told me, his hand resting on my shoulder. But sometimes justice feels like revenge to people who never expected to be held accountable. You are not destroying them. They destroyed the trust. You are simply revealing the wreckage. He looked at me with ancient, sad eyes. Choose the path that lets you live freely afterward. Do not chain yourself to bitterness, but do not chain yourself to their lies either. By the end of the week, the tremors had reached the community. Rumors began to swirl in the church pews and the grocery store aisles. Small towns run on gossip, and the story of the Lee family feud was spreading like wildfire. Why is Chloe suing her own parents? I heard a woman whisper in the checkout line. People looked at me differently, some with judgment, seeing a greedy daughter attacking her elders, others with a new quiet curiosity, as if they were finally seeing the cracks in the Lees' perfect facade. I always wondered how they upgraded so fast. A neighbor murmured to me while I was pumping gas, giving me a sympathetic nod. The pressure worked. My parents, realizing the wall of silence was crumbling, cracked. Maria called me on a Friday afternoon. They want to talk, she said. Their lawyer reached out. They are agreeing to a mediation meeting to keep it in the family and community. They want to settle before we file the lawsuit publicly. Where? I asked. They suggested the restaurant, Maria said. After hours, when the staff is gone. It was perfect. It was terrible. Tell them yes, I said. I hung up the phone and looked at my reflection in the mirror. I didn't look like the scared girl they remembered. I looked like someone who was done paying debts she didn't owe. The place where I bussed tables and swallowed my pain was about to host my reckoning. The restaurant after closing had always been a place of ghosts for me. It was where I had spent thousands of hours sweeping floors, wiping down sticky menus, and listening to my parents talk about a future that didn't include me. Tonight, the space felt less like a dining room and more like a courtroom. The chairs were overturned on the tables, their legs sticking up like dead insects, except for one central section cleared for battle. The overhead lights were dimmed, casting long, harsh shadows across the linoleum. I sat on one side of the aisle with Maria Alvarez and Grandpa Samuel. Across from us sat Helen Thomas and their frantic-looking lawyer, a man named Henderson, who seemed to be sweating through his suit. Nathan sat at the far end of their side, slumped in his chair, refusing to look at anyone. Through the glass front doors, I could see silhouettes lingering under the street lamp, staff members who hadn't gone home, a few neighbors drawn by the unusual gathering. They were the silent jury, sensing that the Lee family myth was about to implode. Maria didn't waste time with pleasantries. She opened her binder and began to lay out the evidence, not with anger, but with a terrifying clinical precision. She read the financial autopsy of my life. On September 12, 2018, Maria stated, her voice echoing in the empty room. A withdrawal of $150,000 was made from the trust. It was paid directly to St. Jude's Private University for Nathan Lee's tuition. My mother flinched. Nathan stared at the tablecloth. On January 4, 2020, Maria continued, turning a page. $80,000 was wired to Johnson Contractors for the renovation of this building's dining area and facade. On March 15, 2021, $45,000 for a Mercedes-Benz SUV registered to Helen Lee. She looked up, removing her reading glasses. This is a systematic misappropriation of funds, a violation of fiduciary duty, and frankly, clear-cut fraud. My parents' defenses began to crumble instantly. My father, usually so commanding, looked small. "We always planned to pay it back," Thomas stammered, wiping his forehead. "When the restaurant took off, when things settled, it was a loan, an internal family loan." "A loan requires consent," Maria said coldly. "And documentation. You have neither." "It was for the family," Helen burst out, her voice shrill. "If the restaurant failed, where would Chloe go? If Nathan didn't succeed, who would take care of us in our old age? Using that money for them was using it for her indirectly. We were building a legacy for all of us." I felt a heat rise in my chest, not of anger, but of finality. I stood up. The scraping of my chair leg against the floor was loud enough to make everyone jump. "You had 12 years," I said, my voice steady, devoid of the trembling that had plagued me for a decade. "You watched me struggle. You watched me beg you for help with rent. You watched me break down when I had to drop out of school. You never once told me, 'We have something for you. You're not alone.' You let me believe I was a burden." Helen opened her mouth to interrupt, but I held up a hand. "I walked home from a double shift in the snow because I couldn't afford gas," I told them, staring directly into my mother's wet eyes. "I remember calling you Mom. I was crying, and you said, 'We can't rescue you every time, Chloe. You have to be strong.' You were sitting on $2 million of my money when you said that." I leaned over the table, my palms flat against the wood. "You didn't just spend my money, you tried to erase me. You erased my choices, my future, my right to grieve without being turned into your martyr. You wanted the money, but you didn't want the daughter who came with it." Maria slid a document across the table. It hit the wood with a heavy slap. "This is a settlement agreement," she announced. "It transfers full ownership of the restaurant building and the business entity to Chloe Lee, effective immediately. It also mandates the transfer of all remaining liquid assets from the accounts funded by the settlement, and it includes a written admission of wrongdoing." "And if we don't sign," Henderson, their lawyer, asked weakly. "Then we file criminal charges in the morning," Maria said. "And considering the amount your clients are looking at, significant prison time." My mother looked around wildly, searching for an escape. That's when the bubble burst. Nathan's girlfriend, who must have heard the rumors swirling through town, appeared at the glass door. She knocked tentatively, peering in. Behind her, I saw the faces of two of the line cooks and a deacon from our church. They were watching. They saw the papers. They saw the tears. The carefully maintained public image of the Lees, the pious, perfect immigrant success story, fractured in real time. Helen saw them too. She realized the audience was already there. She broke down screaming, her composure shattering. "Do you want to destroy us? Is that what you want, Chloe? To watch your parents lose everything? To shame us in front of the whole world?" The old Chloe would have buckled. The old Chloe would have apologized for taking up space. But I looked at the woman who had gaslit me for a decade, and I felt nothing but a cool, distant pity. "You destroyed me first," I answered quietly. "I'm just taking my life back." Thomas looked at the window, then at the contract. He looked at Nathan, who refused to meet his eyes. He looked defeated. With a shaking hand, he picked up the pen and signed. Helen hesitated, sobbing into her hands. Then, realizing the alternative was a jail cell, she grabbed the pen and scrawled her name, the ink tearing the paper. I looked down at the document. The ink on those pages was wet black and permanent. It was the first thing in my life that my name had ever truly owned. The news didn't just spread, it saturated the groundwater of our town. By the following Monday, everyone knew. The whispers followed me down Main Street, echoing off the brick facades. "That's Chloe," they'd say, their voices dropping an octave. "She owns the place now. Did you hear her parents stole from her? I heard they were almost arrested." The community reaction was a fractured mirror. Some people, mostly the older crowd who had idolized my parents' carefully curated image, avoided my gaze crossing the street to avoid walking past the restaurant. But others, the ones who had seen the cracks, the waitresses who knew my parents didn't tip the neighbors who wondered why the daughter drove a rusted sedan while the son drove a BMW, quietly offered their support. A nod here, a squeezed hand there. "Good for you," a local mechanic told me while I was buying coffee. About time someone stood up. I didn't just take over the restaurant, I exorcised it. The first thing I did was rip down the pretentious velvet drapes and the photos of my parents shaking hands with local politicians. I rebranded. The name, the Golden Lotus. A tribute to my parents' vanity was scraped off the window. In its place, I stenciled the table. It was simple, unadorned, and honest. I changed the concept from overpriced fusion to a community hub. I instituted pay what you can nights on Tuesdays, ensuring that people who were actually struggling people like the girl I used to be could eat a hot meal with dignity. I set up a scholarship fund for local youth funded ethically from the restored assets and the revenue that was finally flowing into the right pockets. I was using my reclaimed wealth to build a community, not just a fortress of comfort. But the external changes were easier than the internal demolition. I started seeing a therapist, a woman with kind eyes who didn't flinch when I told her about the accident or the theft. We spent hours unpacking the survivor's guilt that had been my constant companion since Emily died. I realized I had spent a decade apologizing for being alive. My parents had turned me into a sacrificial lamb, convincing me that my suffering was the rent I paid for existing after my sister didn't. Setting a boundary with abusive parents isn't betrayal, Chloe, my therapist told me during a particularly hard session. It's self-preservation. You are not erasing them. You are just refusing to be erased by them. My contact with Helen and Thomas dwindled to almost nothing. They moved out of the suburbs and into a small, cramped rental house on the edge of town. Their social circle, once vast and fawning, had evaporated. Occasionally, my phone would buzz with a text from my mother. "We miss you. Can we just talk? We are family." There were no apologies, just emotional hooks baited with guilt. I learned not to bite. I replied briefly, clearly, and firmly. "No. Not until you acknowledge what you did without excuses." They never replied to that. They wanted the daughter who absorbed their sins, not the woman who held up a mirror. The most difficult adjustment, surprisingly, was Nathan. He had been stripped of his princely status overnight. The settlement agreement had cut off his tuition payments and his rent allowance. To his credit, he didn't beg. He moved out of his luxury apartment and into a shared dorm with 3 other guys. He took out student loans. He got a job in the campus library. He came to see me one rainy afternoon, standing in the entryway of the table while I was prepping for the dinner rush. He looked thinner, tired, the golden shine rubbed off by reality. We sat at a corner booth, the air between us heavy with things unsaid. "I'm finishing med school," he said, staring at his hands. "On my own dime this time. It's hard." "It's supposed to be," I said, not unkindly. He was silent for a long time. Then he looked up, his eyes wet. "I heard them, Chloe. Years ago. I was a freshman. I heard Mom on the phone with the bank talking about the trust. I knew there was money. I didn't know the details, but I knew it was related to the accident." He paused, swallowing hard. "I didn't ask because I didn't want to know. I knew if I asked, I might have to give up the car or the apartment, so I just pretended I didn't hear." It was a confession of willful ignorance, a confirmation that he had been a passive beneficiary of my exploitation. "You can't undo what you benefited from, Nathan," I told him, feeling a profound sense of distance. "You enjoyed the shade of a tree you knew was poisoning me. I can't just forget that." He nodded, accepting the judgment. "But," I added, "you can decide who you want to be now. You're not their project anymore. You're just you." He left without asking for anything, which was a start. As the restaurant thrived, filling with noise and life and people who were there for the food rather than the status, I retreated to the small office in the back. I opened my laptop to check the inventory, but a notification popped up in my personal email. It was from a coding and health tech boot camp, a prestigious intensive program I had dreamed of applying to 5 years ago, but had deleted the bookmark because the tuition was impossible. I stared at the screen. The tuition was still expensive, but for the first time in my life, looking at the bank balance that bore my name, expensive, didn't mean impossible. It just meant a choice. I clicked on the application link. My hands hovered over the keyboard. Their choices had stolen my past, locked me in a cage of debt and duty. But as the cursor blinked in the name field, I realized the cage was open. My future was suddenly wide open, waiting for my signature. 1 year later, my life had become a beautiful, chaotic balancing act. The frantic rhythm of the dinner rush was now punctuated by the rhythmic clacking of my keyboard as I debugged Python scripts in the back office. I had completed the health tech certification program I'd dreamed of for years, and now I was working on a freelance project for a local hospital network, building a patient portal that would actually help people navigate the system, the kind of system that had almost crushed me. The table didn't need me to hover over every plate anymore. I had hired a manager, a sharp-witted woman named Elena, who ran the floor with a firmness I admired. Her presence bought me the most expensive luxury of all time. It allowed me to travel to a tech conference in Seattle last month, something the old Chloe, tethered by guilt and poverty, could never have imagined. My definition of family had undergone a radical renovation. The biological hierarchy that had strangled me was gone, replaced by a network of people who actually showed up. Jordan wasn't just my best friend. He was my business partner in the community outreach programs we ran. Grandpa Samuel was a fixture in the corner booth, holding court with the regulars, finally the patriarch of a family that respected him. We hosted community nights on Thursdays, where the pay-what-you-can model turned into a town hall of resilience. I listened to stories of betrayal, of job losses, of medical debts, and I realized my story wasn't unique. It was just one thread in a larger tapestry of survival. I used the settlement money differently than my parents had. There were no luxury SUVs or vanity renovations. Instead, when my dishwasher's son needed emergency dental work, the bill was paid quietly before the shift ended. When a local high schooler needed a laptop for college, it appeared on her desk. I was spending the money, yes, but I was washing the stain off of it with every transaction. As for Helen and Thomas, they were still in town, but they had faded into the background like characters written out of the main plot. They lived in a small 2-bedroom rental near the highway. The public sympathy they had banked on had largely evaporated once the truth settled into the foundation of the town. Some of their old friends stuck by them out of stubbornness, but the reverence was gone. They were just two people who had made a terrible gamble and lost. They occasionally came into the restaurant for the Thursday specials. I never served them. I would watch them from the security monitor in the back office. They looked older, smaller. They ate quickly, heads down, and they always made sure to leave before my shift officially started, avoiding the confrontation that neither of us wanted. Watching them, I didn't feel the rage that had fueled me a year ago. I felt a complicated mix of sorrow and distance. They were strangers who happened to share my DNA, people who had loved the idea of me, but hated the reality of my needs. Nathan was the only bridge left, though it was a narrow one. He came to visit me in my new apartment above the restaurant one Tuesday afternoon. He was wearing scrubs, dark circles under his eyes, looking exhausted in a way that felt honest. He was finishing med school, but he was doing it on loans and part-time work now. The golden boy sheen was gone, replaced by the grit of someone finally living his own life. "I'm graduating in May," he told me, leaning against my kitchen counter. "I'm going into family practice, not plastic surgery like Mom wanted." "That's good, Nathan," I said, pouring him a coffee. "It suits you better." He hesitated, tracing the rim of the mug. "I heard you're doing free wellness checks at the community nights. I have some free time on Thursdays. I could help. Take blood pressure, do basic screenings. If you'd let me." It was an offering. He wasn't asking for money or forgiveness. He was offering labor. He was trying to pay his own kind of restitution. I looked at him and realized I hadn't fully forgiven him for his years of willful blindness, and maybe I never would. But I could allow a new relationship to grow in the space between us, one built on truth instead of denial. We could use a doctor, I said slowly. But you bus your own table. He smiled, a genuine cracked thing. Deal. That evening, I stood outside the restaurant as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. The sign above the door hummed with a steady, welcoming light. Inside, I could hear the clatter of silverware and the roar of laughter, the sound of a community that had embraced me, not for what I could give them, but for who I was. I thought of Emily. I thought of the $2.4 million that had destroyed my family to save my life. My parents had tried to erase me, to turn me into the quiet shadow that held up their perfect picture. They had threatened me with guilt duty and the weaponized word family. But standing there, owning the concrete beneath my feet, I finally understood what family really was. It wasn't blood. It was who refused to let you vanish. It was the people who didn't ask you to be sacrificed so they could shine. They stole my money, my chances, and my childhood. But as I turned to walk back into the warmth of the life I had built, I knew they couldn't steal the one thing they never believed. I had the courage to write my own story and refuse to disappear. And so the ink dries on a new chapter, leaving the shadows of the past behind where they belong. If this story of justice and resilience resonated with you, please subscribe to support the channel. We want to hear your perspective on Chloe's decision. Drop a comment below as we read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Ashes of Yesterday. We'll see you next time.